Hi guys, Paul here. Hey, I looked at the demos for Ruxit, now called the platform, that Wayne had done, and they're all really good, but the challenge I had was they're all over an hour because they're actual customer demos. There's a lot of elaboration and things in there. So I was hoping just to get kind of a Cliff's Notes version of the clickstream that he uses. So that's what this is, right? So he starts obviously with the home page and describes it as configurable to meet, the perspective of the end user and role specific and all those kind of things. But then he actually talks about the deployment of Ruxit, the platform. And I guess we typically don't do that, but given how cool it is and how easy it is to deploy, I guess it makes sense to kind of show it in the demo. So he just comes over here and opens the sidebar and then scrolls down and says, okay, if you're interested in deploying Ruxit, obviously you click here. And then you can come over here and yes, I want to start the installation. I pick what my platform is, and you can see in the case of Linux, it's very easy. It's just a simple wget to download the install file. You run the install script, and you restart the processes, and basically you're done. So it's really, really super easy to do that. And then he talks about the fact by simply installing that agent on the host, we start instrumenting all the transactions that flow through that, and then we get this thing called the Smartscape. Right? And he talks about the fact that we automatically discover the entire stack, starting at the data center, running all the way up through the applications. Now he focuses on the services, and he picks on a particular service, and the one I tend to gravitate towards is Authenticate. So I can just do a search for Authenticate, and you can see if I zoom in, there's a number of those instances out here, and I can pick any one of them. Let me pick on this guy here. And then you can see that the Smartscape pivots to be in the context just of the authentication service. Talk about the fact that there's that one service, but it's supported by 4 Tomcat processes running on 2 Windows hosts that are both in the same data center. He then talks about the fact that when there's a change to any one of these, let's say a new instance spins up, a new process, a new Tomcat, it'll automatically discover and be identified in here. And you can talk about the fact that change is often a major influence when it comes to problem isolation and things like that. But then what he does, he drills in specifically on that authentication service. So you just click here. Now you're in the context of that, and he talks about the fact that you obviously can see the inputs to the service, and you can pivot over to those if you want. You've got the outputs over here. You can pivot over to those if you want. The service itself has a bunch of metrics descriptive of its performance. And then here's a drill down into the hosts and the processes that are supporting it. So if something is going on with any of those, it's very easy for me to drill into that. Now he does something interesting here. He kind of picks on one of the inputs. And if you pivot over here and show one of the inputs, the idea here is you want to go in here, and you'll see why you do this in a minute. But the idea is to talk about the fact that I can see the most time-consuming request to this input. Now, if I drill into it, I can see something really cool because I can actually see the service flow associated with that. So kind of the payoff is showing this picture here and the fact that for any one of these services you select, you can see all the constituents downstream in a graphical way and see where time is being contributed and things like that, right? If I go back to that process that I selected, that recall is upstream of the Authenticate service, I can get back to Authenticate pretty easily because one of the outputs for this is obviously Authenticate. So if I click on the downstream for this one, there's my Authenticate service once again, right? So I can just click on that, and now I'm back in the context of the Authenticate service. And if there's some kind of issue or problem with this, I can very quickly drill into the requests that are consuming the most time on that service. So you click there. Now here you could do the service flow here as well, but as you'll see in a minute, it's not particularly interesting. That's why he went back to one of the ones upstream. But then if I go back to this, where you kind of want to go from here is just very quickly go to the response time hotspots. If there is slowness with this request on this service, why is that happening? In this case, the major contributor obviously is database. And as you guess, you can just click on that and drill into that database activity up to and including, what specifically was one of the calls that took the most time and all those kind of things. Excuse me. So that's really all he did when it came to, instrumenting and monitoring the stack itself. He then pivots over and talks about like end user experience. So the way he does that is he goes back to the home screen, and he pivots in and zeroes in on all the applications that are automatically discovered. And then he picks on one of these, and let's pick on our good old friend Easy Travel, right? But then when you go in the context of Easy Travel, you see all this kind of information, right? What kind of browsers, geographic breakdown, all these kind of things. You can talk in some detail about this. The interesting thing to note here is that you can filter on actually the kinds of users that are being shown here. Real users, synthetic users, maybe search robots, things like that, and you can pivot around to any one of those. But then what he does, he goes down here, and he talks a little bit about these, but then he focuses on the top 3 consumers, the top 3 user actions. Now, the interesting thing is you can't drill straight into those from this panel. You've got to go into the full details and see all of those. And then having drilled into all of them, you can have a pivot over and pick on one of these guys right here. And this is where you can see, in the context of this particular user action or page, a wealth of information about this. He points out the fact here that you can, in fact, filter here as well. So if we just go down to just the real users, I can see the data refresh and all those things. So then what he does, he just kind of rolls down here, and he talks about the fact that, well, what are the major contributors on this guy, right? And you can say in this particular case, it's this images deal. So I can click on this and get information descriptive of this, up to and including a response time breakdown for the web request coming from this that's taking the most time. So that's really all he does on the end user experience. He kind of drills down to this level. And then suggests to people that, hey, this is, it was kind of interesting to show that kind of analysis and that kind of drill down, but that's not the motivation behind the platform. The platform, the motivation is to surface things into problems, thereby dramatically reducing, if not eliminating, the need to do any of these more traditional drill downs. So what he does, he pivots back to the home page and focuses up in this problems area. Now you can see there's obviously nothing live at the moment, but simply drilling into it, you'll get presented with all the problems from the last 72 hours. And the one he picks on is basically one of these VMware ones. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a search for the VMware problems. Now the thing to look for that I liked, make it real obvious, is this one that has CPU saturation as the root cause, and you'll see why in a minute. But if you pick that, this is where you can really draw a distinction between traditional APM technologies and what we're doing here with the platform, because it identifies, the problem, and the problem here is user action degradation that happens for all users all the time, and then the more interesting thing is, well, what's the root cause? Why did this happen? And from the perspective of the platform, it says that, well, the reason was you've got CPU saturation. And to see in more detail about that, analyze root cause, in this case, it's pretty obvious. You see the problem presenting itself right there, right? So that's kind of a pretty cool setup for how that happens. Then if you go back to the problem definition, what he does, he pivots over in here and says, well, let's go check out, how the platform actually figured this out. So if you click on this down here, you get this cool representation that shows the auto-discovered dependencies for this. And then you can go over here and show the evolution of all the typical incidents that would fire when this happens. So you click the play button, and you can see down here all those kind of incidents present themselves as the chart shows red. So this kind of really cool visualization that shows how the platform figured out that this actually was the problem. So what he does here, he kind of focuses in on the time period where it's the worst, if you will. And in this case, you can see that, in the absence of this platform, you're going to get bombarded by all these isolated alerts here without any particular context. So what we've actually done here, what the platform has done, is gone ahead and not only identified these things, it's correlated them, but it's also presumed causation on your behalf and said, oh, gee, all of these things caused the outage I saw at the higher level. And then he actually says and points out that in any one of these things, you can right-click and you can, or left-click, and you actually drill in to see the details of why did that thing specifically turn red. So that's really kind of what he does. He focuses on 3 areas. That is kind of the full stack instrumentation. He then pivots over and shows the end user experience piece, but then he wraps it up by saying, those first 2 things are interesting, and drilling down is kind of the cool, typical way through which someone would interact with one of these kind of technologies. But we've kind of pivoted on its side, and with the platform, we're focusing on problems. We're surfacing problems directly without having the user have to do that manual correlation and manual presumption of causation. So hopefully that's helpful. Hopefully that gives you a quick idea of the clickstream that Wayne likes to use. And we'll talk to you later. See ya.